Hello everyone. It's time for our presentation, and if you're out there, come in here. All right, sorry about that. So this presentation's a new one. I did it a week ago for our club, and so it's only been used once, so it's really good. And it's dealing with sumps and plumbing, because you want to make really good choices as you're setting up your tank, so that way, hopefully, you won't have to mess with it later. And a lot of times when we're setting up tanks, we go ahead and we do it one way, and then when things go wrong with the aquarium, we have to start over again. We say, I'm going to do it better this time. But ideally, with enough knowledge in advance when you start your project, you can actually do it the right way the first time, and you won't really have to do any more enhancements if something happens like this. My tank, after 13 months, sprung a leak and just started peeing all over the floor at 1 in the morning. So I had foresight when I made this room. I actually put in a French drain, so if water ever came out of the tank, it would hopefully go down that drain. And it literally did, and I didn't even have to mop. It just went away. It was awesome. Not a good day for me, but at least I didn't have a mess in the house. But you want to plan as much as you can in advance. You want to really think about what can go wrong, come up with those points of failure, outwit them, be smarter than Murphy's Law whenever you can, but realize Murphy never stops trying. The one thing that you need to keep in mind is you only have so much space. And with that limited space, you've got to figure out what all you can cram in there, but there's a limit. I'm saying the word limit multiple times, but we don't need every single piece of gear. And a lot of people will say, well, I want a refugium, and I want a turf scrubber, I want filter socks, I want a fleece pad, I want a cup filter. And they're like, and I need 6 different reactors, I'm gonna have 19 dosing pumps, and they try to put all this, plus a protein skimmer and a return pump, and 2 800-watt heaters, and it's like, your tank is how big? Oh, it's a 40 breeder. It's like, no, you cannot have all these things. So let's start with the basics. You're gonna need a return pump, you're gonna need a protein skimmer, and we'll grow from that point. We'll see what we can actually put in there. But every desire you have may not be a good plan, and that's important. So we'll talk about what you can use and what you need versus what could be a want. And then bottom line, you want to be able to work in this tank, you want to be able to work in the sump and work around the aquarium as much as possible. If it's really clogged up and cluttered and condensed and tight with everything in there, you can't work in there. You can't reach in and clean something in the sump. Like, let's say you're changing carbon and it's spilled into the sump and there's all this carbon in the bottom, but you got to take out the protein skimmer, and you got to take out the heaters, and you got to remove the turf scrubber, and you got to take out the refugium light, and you got plumbing in the way, and you're just like, oh my God, this sucks. So if we create enough room to work, if something were to happen, something were to spill, you can still go in there and you can vacuum it out without too much trouble. So the slide I want you to look at first is this one, the preferred gear. The one thing you're going to need with a sump for absolute certainty is the return pump. And BRS was promoting a couple of years ago that everyone should have 2 return pumps. I agree with them and I disagree with them. You should have 1 return pump in the sump, and you should have 1 in the box on your shelf ready to go. I want my mic louder than his. It's a competition at this point. Okay, so I want you to have a backup return pump, because if your return pump were to fail, you need another one. It will fail on a holiday, it'll fail late at night, it'll fail when the fish store is closed. It'll fail when Amazon can't deliver it within the hour. Okay, so you need to have a return pump, but you don't need 2 of them running at the same time. The only reason you should have 2 return pumps in your tank is if you are only visiting your tank every 2 weeks, like a maintenance company. Those guys come in, they do maintenance, and they leave, and they're not back for 13 more days. And so what could go wrong? Well, if they have 2 pumps, they know if one fails, the other's still getting water to the tank, all is well. But if you're at home with your tank, or if your tank's at your office that you go to all the time, if the pump fails, you see that, you get a notification if you have a controller, and you can take care of it and replace it with another one. If you buy 2 identical pumps, you can remove one easily, put the new one in, within 5 minutes flat, all the plumbing fits perfectly. If you have 2 totally different pumps, it's a 30-minute project. So ideally, buy 2, put one away, and what you can do when it's time to do maintenance, Take the dirty one out and clean it. Take the other one, put it into play, and save the cleaned one for next time. You can just rotate them. The next thing I feel every reef tank needs is a protein skimmer, because it removes the dissolved organic compounds in the water. It traps the particulates. They stick to the bubbles rise and collect in the cup. But it does something else that a lot of people don't talk about. It drives off CO2 from your aquarium. I always thought protein skimmers added air. It makes oxygen, but it doesn't. And I didn't know this until just like a couple of years ago, when someone much smarter than myself was talking about it, and I was listening to him like, what? And he said, when you're running a protein skimmer, it's driving off CO2. And I thought, that's fascinating. And I wish I'd known that 20 years ago. Now, when it comes to fleece rollers or socks or having none at all, I'm actually a fan of none at all, because any particulates blowing through the system is potential food for something. Whether it's filter feeders, corals, fish, not all waste is evil, and something will probably consume it. So I wouldn't really need to trap everything, but some people want that pristine water. So that's going to be a desire, or it's going to be a choice of installing something, but will it make it impossible to work in your sump later? Like, for example, Trigger Systems is here, and they're selling a sump that has a fleece roller built into the sump. That means you are using that sump like that forever. But if you have a loose one, you could take it out if you decide you don't like it and still have the space for something else one day. And that's something that I kind of would be concerned with. I like to have modular choices and be able to remove something and utilize it a different way, perhaps. I do use filter socks a few times a year for a few days, especially if I'm about to take pictures of my tank. I like to run the socks for 24 hours to kind of catch some of the bigger stuff, and then my water looks nice for the photographs. But I don't want to take them out all the time, because you have to clean them every 3 days. And if you see a filter sock in your sump just overflowing, it is clearly not doing its job. It is just sitting there full of decay, full of waste, adding nutrients to the water, not filtering anything, and sometimes can even be noisy. So it's much better to not run them at all if you're not going to do it, if you're not going to clean them. I definitely recommend 2 heaters, never 1, and they should always be the correct size. Again, I'm going to be on Burris's case a little bit today, because there's just been stuff that's been said that bothers me. And the thing that bothered me a lot, besides the 2 return pumps, was 2 800-watt heaters. And everyone was like buying them. I'm like, why? What size is your aquarium? Like, I have a 100-gallon. And I'm just like, wow. 2 800-watt heaters. That's 1,600 watts of heat. That is more than a hairdryer. And it will be pulling close to 16 amps of power on your circuit. So we need to realize, what is the right size heater for your tank? It's 3 watts per gallon generally. So a 100-gallon tank needs 300 watts of heat, not 2 800s. So we want to get a 300-watt heater, right? No, we want 250-watt heaters. And the reason we do that is if one heater were to fail and stick on, it doesn't have the juice to cook the tank. The tank temperature might rise a little bit more to where you notice, but it'll never be a 95-degree aquarium. So there was this one woman, and she was really adamant about her 2 800-watt heaters. And I kept saying, it's too much for your tank. And she goes, no, I like to have redundancy. And I kept saying, it's too much heat. And it took a long time for me to understand. She thought, if one 800-watt heater dies, at least I have the other. It's like, oh, okay, so you want to have an extra one. No, you can't have that because it's too big for your tank. So instead, I would have liked her to have 2 300s. And at least it's more close to what her tank needed, not 1,600 watts of heat. So very important that you don't use heaters that are too large. I always recommend a refugium on a reef tank, but algae turf scrubbers are getting better and better. That might be the way to go for you. You might prefer that and not have the space in your sump for a refugium. But if you can do a refugium, I recommend that it's 10% of the display tank. So if your aquarium's 100 gallons, you need a refugium that's 10 gallons. If it's smaller than that, it may not do much for your aquarium. A preferred piece of gear for me is always a controller of some kind. I like the Apex. I also like the Hydros. I feel like the Hydros is coming along really nicely, and I've told this to them, so it's no insult. I cannot wait to see what their app looks like in 2 years. because it's going to be amazing. Right now, it's there. It's functional, but it's not there for me visually, and I'm picky about that kind of stuff. But other than that, the ability to hit a button on a screen and turn off 6 different pieces of gear while I feed the aquarium or while I do a water change, and then automatically turn on again instead of me pulling out 15 plugs and then pushing them back in. That's important to me, and I really appreciate that. And I even more, I'd like a button I can just press on the side of the tank to like do the feeding. I really don't like to pull out my phone, open up the app, find the option, hit the button. Okay, now I can feed my tank. I really want a button, but that's not there for me yet at this time. But I have that on my reef, and I love it, and it stops my return pump, and it stops my protein skimmer. And the reason I stop those two is I want all the food to stay in the tank and none to go into the sump. I don't want it to be filtered out. I want the fish to have their 10 minutes to eat. And I put my food in the tank, and after 10 minutes, the return pump turns on. And then after 5 more minutes, the protein skimmer turns on. Because if you had the skimmer come on immediately while the sump is full of water, the skimmer is going to want to overflow. So I have it on a delay timer, and that's the beauty of a controller. It does all this for you. So I really do recommend that. And then an absolute necessity, besides protein skimmer and return pump, is an automatic top-off system. If you are a person pouring in water each day or every few days, like I used to do, you'd see the water go down in the tank about this far, like, I should add some water. And I would lift up my big, heavy jug, and I'm dumping it in. I'm like, oh my God, I hate doing this. Instead of adding just a little bit every day, one day, I think I made one with a float switch, an extension cord, and a small maxi jet maybe. And it would top off all day and all night as needed. The tank never changed. It was so easy. And once a week, I had to fill the container. I was like, this is the most wonderful thing I've ever done in my life. So I highly recommend something that tops off your tank so you only have to look at how much is left in the reservoir next to your reef. Oh, hang on. Let me go back. Optional gear, UV light and the pump that feeds through the UV light is an option. Some people like them. I've never run UV, but if I were to run it, I might run it on a quarantine tank because that would be for fish that possibly come in infected, and maybe you could take care of that, but I don't run them inside my display tank. I've never run ozone, probably because my tank doesn't look like it needs it. And secondarily, I grew up in California where they had ozone alert days, don't go outside. So why would I pump ozone into the inside of my home? And my air conditioner company even said, can we hook up ozone in here? I'm like, absolutely not. It's going to go through every vent in my house and go right into my lungs? No. So I know that's me being a little paranoid, but I don't run ozone. But if you do, you have to run it a very specific way, in a very safe way. And I believe you also have to do some kind of carbon to like absorb whatever may leak out. So do your homework if you're going to go with that one. A manifold is an optional piece of gear, but it's super nice. A manifold would be a series of plumbing, and you'll see pictures here in a moment, where you have like one large pipe with a bunch of valves on it going to one pump. And so you have one circulation pump pushing into that to feed all the reactors, and you have one return pump, and your sump is nice and clean. Back in the day, we'd have the return pump, and we'd have a phosphate reactor, and we might have GFO reactor, and then we have a calcium reactor feed pump, and you had all these maxi jets everywhere, and you had cords everywhere. And to have one pump feed all the things at once, where you just have valves to adjust the flow rate in each one, was super convenient. But you have to think about where they will be, where you can reach the valves. If it's into your way all the time, do you want the lines to point down with the tubing, or do you want them to point forward? Do you want them to point that way? I mean, there's a lot of choices, but you want to think about how I'm going to work in this aquarium for the rest of my life. Automatic water changes, I still don't embrace them. A lot of people do. My only warning with automatic water changes is double check your salinity every single week, because it's doing it automatically. It's taking out some water, it's putting some water in. Your tank's going to be so much better now. But what can happen, and what happened to a club member here in Dallas-Fort Worth, he said, my reef, and he had a beautiful tank. He goes, I don't know what's going on. My reef is just getting worse and worse. And he posted pictures on the club forum. It was bad. And I was like, what happened? He says, I don't know. I got automatic water changes. Everything's great. I did all my water tests. But he never said the word salinity. And so finally he checked it, and it was 1.019. So what was happening was it was pumping out water, And he was probably topping off water, what was being pumped out possibly at the same time. And his protein skimmer is collecting water. And sometimes protein skimmers become volcanoes and waste more water, which means more top off, which is diluting your water constantly. So we want to make sure our salinity doesn't budge. So automatic water tests, water changes are fine as long as you are checking it yourself every single week to make sure it stays at 1.026, and your reef will be fine. You can have all the automatic water changes you like. Dosing, very popular. Back in the day, we would just pour it in. Now we all have dosing pumps. If you want to use dosing pumps, don't do it from day one. You set up your tank, you get it operational, you cycled it, you've added livestock, you buy the products like alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, potassium, whatever it is you're going to pour in the tank, right? Learn how much your tank needs by pouring that in every day yourself by hand. So you take the little cup, you read the instructions, it says 5 milliliters for 25 gallons. My tank's a 75 gallon, I need 15 milliliters. You pour in 15 each day. How does the tank do? You know what? It seems like my tank needs 20 milliliters a day. So you pour in 20 every day for another week. Tank looks good. Now you know you should dose 20 milliliters of that one product every day. And then you can get into the programming of multiple doses per day or however you want to do it. But to just hook up the bottle to a dosing pump and say 7 ml, I hope that's right, that would be terrible and it could go badly for your tank. So we want to really know. So I usually recommend hand dose for a month. Learn what everything needs to be, and now you know what to program, and your tank should be successful. Lids are a nice optional gear for over the sump. Texas doesn't have basements, but sometimes the sump might be located in a place that's too cold, and having lids on top of it could help trap some of the temperature. But it could be in the way of the tubing, the wires, the probes, all those things going in. You might find that the lid is just in your way. And then finally, a nice option is to have cabinet lighting above your sump so you can flip it on and see what you're doing in there as you're cleaning, as you're rearranging, as you're hooking things up and disconnecting things. To be able to see is really nice. And you can set it up with Alexa or whatever you want to do to where you pop open a door and the light just turns on and you close the door like your refrigerator does. And that way you've got some instant gratification. Now, we have to ask ourselves, what can go wrong with my new tank with my sump? And obviously the first one would be that the pump fails and the tank starts draining all the water out and the sump overflows and the cabinet gets wet and the carpet gets wet and the room gets wet. We don't want any of that to happen. So when we're setting up a sump and we're setting up the plumbing going into the tank, we want to plumb it in the way where it will not siphon out too much water so that the sump can hold all the water in the event of a power outage. Now, I see power outages frequently where I live in Fort Worth, and I have everything set up to where the sump holds and there's tons of extra room for even more water were there to be a leak of some kind or something went wrong. But if you have not tested your tank yet, the simplest thing, you get it all operational, everything's perfect, and then you reach under the tank and you pull out the return pump and the protein skimmer and you see what happens. And if everything fits in the sump, perfect, you did your job. Plug them back in, be happy. But if you see the sump filling up and filling up and filling up and getting to the top, quickly plug things in. Change your plumbing at the top by lifting up a little higher so it can't siphon out as much water, or have less water in the sump in the first place, and then do the test again and find out where that level needs to be in your tank to operate perfectly. And then you can mark the front of the sump with this is my operating line, this is my maximum full line, this is my too low line. These are things you can use, and you can definitely use it if you're not home and you have to ask someone like a spouse or a tank sitter or a club member, hey, I need you to check on my tank, something's wrong, and you can explain things because it's clearly marked. The contaminant in the room. This one could happen to some of you guys here. If there's something in the room that is getting into the tank or the sump, it can actually affect the livestock, or it can definitely affect the livestock in a bad way. One guy had his aquarium in the living room upstairs, and he had a basement down below, but we have 2-story houses in Texas, so something could be happening like that here too. And he never thought this would happen. I mean, who would think of this? His sump was in the basement. Above it was the laundry room. and someone accidentally spilled a bottle of Tide. And the Tide just flowed off the machine and hit the wooden floorboards, went through the floor, went through the ceiling of the basement, and dripped Tide into the sump. And the whole sump was filled with bubbles, the whole tank was milky, and he ran downstairs and he discovers it all came from here. So if you're in a situation where you feel like there's anything above your sump that could fall in, then it might be good to look at what you could put on the ceiling above it to protect the sump from any kind of spatter. So if you have a room that has things that are in potential risk, you could literally hang a board above with cables going up just so they would spill and fall off the edges away from the sump, for example. But who would have thought Tide upstairs would get into my sump in the basement? It's just one of those crazy things. The other products that people use could be hairspray, like if the reef tank is in their bedroom and their spouse is in the master bath, for example. And it could be the scented candles, the room fresheners, spraying Febreze. All those kind of things can get in your system. So do you need to protect your tank and sump from things getting in? What about children and grandchildren? They can quickly, within nanoseconds, put something in your sump because it needs to be there. And I watched this happen in my house. My son was visiting with his son, so my grandson, and we're literally watching him at all times. I literally didn't take my eyes off of him. And he ran over to the sump and ran back. And I was like, okay. And my son's like, no, he put something in there. And I was like, there's no way. I was watching him. Literally, I didn't have my eyes down. And he moved to the Calurpa, and he pulled out a pair of batteries. I was like, that's crazy. He did it so fast. And I was looking. So, if you can, woodwork around your tank, boards to protect, closed doors, locks, you name it, stuff can happen. And we want to be very careful not to let your reef tank suffer because children or pets are flinging things into your sump. The leaking part, there are certain things we can do to avert a leak. We can correct the plumbing and all that, but the sump could spring a leak. So some people put a pond liner or like a shower liner inside the stand. And I helped a client in Dallas install I built the sump, and I went to install it under his big aquarium, and he had this pond liner that went in the cabinet and went up 12 inches. I was like, wow, this thing's gonna hold water. And it wasn't a month later, he called me up and he said, I broke my return pump. And I was like, no, I just plumbed that in, everything's perfect. So he had the sump, he had a huge external return pump, which external means the motor is out in the air. It's not supposed to be underwater. But he had this weird hole in the pipe in the tank, and there was a dowel sticking out of it in the tank. I was like, why is there like a wooden stick in there? And he said, oh yeah, I drilled something wrong, so I just put that in there. Apparently this dowel popped out, and it siphoned the tank down and filled the pond liner perfectly and submerged his brand new Sequence Dart Gold return pump. It was like a $400 pump, got destroyed in minutes, and it was so new. So we want to be careful that your liner is enough to catch some water, but make sure your pump is still elevated high enough that it stands above the water so it doesn't short out and kill power to the room and kill your whole reef tank. Okay. If you're really stuck and you're trying to figure something out and you don't know what to do, call a friend. There's no such thing as a stupid question. It's better to just ask and learn. And remember I talked to you about filter socks that were not doing their job? That's a perfect example right there. This was at the fish store by my house, and he doesn't like to clean them. So they just sit there doing that. It's much better to remove the socks on a regular basis and put in clean ones. So if you don't like cleaning them very much, buy a lot of socks. Buy enough for a month and buy yourself a diaper pail and pull the dirty ones out, put them in the pail, put the lid on top, no smell, put clean ones in, and then once a month, wash all the socks. That would be your solution. This is a sump and top-off container I made for a client here in Dallas, and she was doing a fish-only system. So she wanted 2 huge filter socks to catch the fish waste because she loves all her tangs. And then she wanted a protein skimmer, she wanted a return zone, and then we had the big top-off container to replace the water that evaporates. That's a very simple sump. It's not complicated, it's not colorful, it's easy to work in. That's the kind of stuff I designed. This was another one I made for another person in Fort Worth, and he literally made that whole assembly there for a fleece roller, and he 3D printed all his components for it. I just had to build the sump to fit around it. But the nice thing is he could lift the entire thing out if he didn't want to use it. It wasn't permanently in there. Now this sump here is actually a very popular sump for my website because the water goes in on the left and it goes in on the right. So it's draining into both ends of the sump at the same time, and then it meets in the middle, which is this zone right over here. Here's the refugium, here's the return zone, here's the skimmer section. So water's draining in here, and it flows through the baffles into the return zone, and water's draining here, flows through the teeth, and into the return zone. Now, when you're setting up a sump like this, the benefit is you can send 75% of your water into the skimmer section, and you can put 25% of the raw, dirty aquarium water into the refugium. And all that water coming from the tank going to the refugium will feed the plants because it gets fish waste, it gets a little bit of fish food. It's an ideal situation. You don't end up with microbubbles, you don't end up with any issues. You can have slow flow through the refugium so the plants can grow because the light penetrates better. Then if it's really choppy water, the light can't break through it as well. The other side, the protein skimmer is doing the bulk of the water. And if you do filter socks or the fleece roller, it can help trap particulates. This scenario has been so popular that I used to visit fish stores across the nation, and they would literally make out of a glass tank with some baffles that layout. And I was like, oh, that's my Model F sump. So it's kind of nice. Now, what I do with my drains and my sumps, because I don't like filter socks, is I have the drains going to what I call a bubble tower. So the water flows in there, and you fill the whole bottom half with rock rubble. Just fill it up with rubble, and as the water and air from the drain pipes mixes in there, it boils in the box, but those teeth at the bottom, the water flows out really cleanly, and you don't have any bubbles at all in the sump. And then the protein skimmer will be right next to that spot, and you want to make sure the protein skimmer is installed where the output of the skimmer is away from the return zone. So if you have a skimmer section and you have a return zone here with some baffles, I would have the skimmer's output where the water's coming out of the skimmer here, so the water has to go around the body of the skimmer, through the baffles, and by then there's no bubbles. And now we have a bubble-free environment. If you see bubbles coming into your tank nonstop, the first thing you should do is grab a flashlight and look in the return zone and see if you see bubbles there. If there's no bubbles there, everything's running right, and there's a problem on the top of your tank. But if you see bubbles there, then you need to figure out how to stop them in the sump. This right here is my sump under my 400-gallon reef. And this full length in the front is the refugium. That spot in the back is my skimmer section. This is the return zone. This right here is for cooling fans to blow down on the water to keep the tank cool. And you'll see all of those holes on the end of the sump. That is where the water goes in. Normally, every sump I've ever done, I had the drains go straight down into the top of the sump. But I said, I want to do it differently. And MRC does this with their sumps. They send the water in through the side, and it comes in just pure water, no air bubbles. I was like, I want to do that. And it was so much easier to plumb because my aquarium has an external overflow box, and the drains go straight down and elbow straight in. So here's the tank with the sump, and I hadn't put the plumbing in yet, but here is my overflow box on the left picture with a series of drains. And then you can see the pipes coming down, and you can see how they used to go inside the sump from above. When I replaced the sump with a new one, I changed it, and now you can see here on the right picture, my drain comes down and would go into a gate valve, continue to go straight down, and into the sump from the side. And it works so nice, so clean, so quiet. I could not quiet the water pouring in the top at all. I put lids on there, bulkheads, gaskets. It just rumbled, and I hated that. This was so much nicer. And then over here on this side, this is the feed going into my refugium. And I've got an 1.5-inch pipe here, but down below, it's 1-inch pipe. I actually reduced it because I don't need as much flow in my refugium. So I have water draining, the valve closed off, so it's pure water coming out of the pipe and flowing into the refugium. This one is water and air mixed together. And then I have 2 more drains as emergency drains. And so here's a quick video showing the plumbing with the drain. And I had to make the drain come outward to fit around the Vortec pump. You see it goes straight down through the gate valve, which is that thing with the red handle, straight down, and elbows straight in right behind that jug at the bottom. Also on the edge of my sump, I built the sump with a shelf to put my trident, and that was just a nice little additive because I was making my own sump. Now your return assembly is the part that squirts the water into the tank, and I've run this system like this for 13 years. You'll notice right there is a check valve. You can see it in the far left picture. That check valve is installed backwards. Most people put the check valve in the line going up, and they want it when the power turns off, they want the water to start going down and slam it shut. Well, those are prone for failure because vermitids and things will live in there, and then the day you need that flapper to come down, there's obstacles, so it comes down almost all the way, but it's letting water leak past, and it's quietly draining the tank and quietly overflowing the sump. Doesn't work, so I never recommend them. But this one is on top of my aquarium, and the way it works is the water shoots up into the returns, pushes water in, but when the return pump is turned off, the water tries to siphon, it sucks open the check valve and it closes a valve. It's so neat. I have a video showing exactly how this works, and I show it from like 19 different angles like it's a sports event. So you guys can watch that and see how it works. It's a simple solution. I've had several friends copy me and they love it. It breaks the siphon instantly because it's sucking air into the pipe. Also, because these return lines are so low in my tank, I'm using the random flow generators from VCA. If I didn't have that check valve on top, the tank could literally siphon down 4 inches of water. That would be a lot of water coming down. But because of the check valve opening up, sucking in air, the water doesn't budge at all. It's so cool. And like I said, I've done this for 13 years. And in 13 years, I had to replace that check valve one time because it finally failed after like 7 years or 8 years. It just got slimy and it got hardened. And I bought a new one from Marine Depot and I'm back in action. Here's an example of a manifold. So you've got, in this case, I did it vertically with the valves there, and each one was a different size piece of tubing. One went to a biopellet reactor, one went to a carbon reactor, one went to my calcium reactor. And you can just see how I tried to arrange it where I wouldn't have things in my way, but there's things always in your way. So you just have to really decide what can you put up with. This was another manifold I had previously that ran horizontally along the top of the sump, and it pointed the valves inward toward the equipment. And I thought, that'll be great, because I can just reach over. I hated it. It was always in my way. And so that's why I changed it to that vertical one you saw, and I still have that vertical one to this day. And this one on the right, you can see there's a little tiny valve. That was to feed a calcium reactor with a gate valve, where I could dial it down to the exact amount of flow I needed to go through the reactor. And that came from US Plastics. By the way, those valves with the orange handles, back, that's what you want. If you can get these rather than some from Lowe's and Home Depot, they always turn. They're easy to use. So I highly recommend them. When you're setting up your system and you're doing your sump, you need to have plenty of salt water on hand. And don't be a Superman. Ask friends to come over and help. Bribe them with cookies and pizza and beer or whatever you got to do. But having someone there to assist you while you're working will make this so much easier. Also, become a member of your local club. Here, I'm actually the president of DFW Mass. So if you wanted to be a member of my club, you're welcome to do so. We've been around like 30 years. And we have a big club of about 600 members. So being a member, you can get on the forum and ask for help. You can also ask them to come over. You can get advice. You can come to club events. You can learn more. Become friends with your local fish store. Become friends with the owner. Get their phone number. Because when your tank breaks at 9 p.m., you can call them and say, could you do me a huge favor? And they might say yes. Or they might say, no, but I can get you that by morning. Whatever. But at least you could possibly call. Don't think of them as the enemy or think of them as trying to take all your money because you can buy it online. Those fish stores are so important. That's how we got into the hobby. We bought a tank from them. We bought fish from them. We bought corals from them. We bought test kits. And like, wait, I can get this from Amazon? I can save 10%? Well, saving money is nice, but having a fish store you can walk into and explore and hang out with other hobbyists is super important. And I don't want you to miss out on that relationship. So have those numbers handy so you can call people for help. And follow people you admire. If you see their tank and you love it, follow them on Facebook, follow them on Instagram, learn from what they're doing. If you have questions, ask those people because those people know what they're doing. When someone gives me advice for my tank, I immediately want to see their tank first before I want to listen to their advice. It's just their calling card. And if they have just a miserable pile of rocks, I am much less likely to listen to them. If they've got a gorgeous reef, I'm like, that person seems to know what they're talking about. So that's just how I do it. But, there's a lot to take. I mean, listen, I'm on YouTube. People have seen me. And I had a couple people, because I used to stand in front of my tank and film with a really bad webcam. And I had this guy write, "You sound like you know what you're talking about, but your tank looks like crap." And I was like, it's the webcam. Trust me, if you were here, you'd love it. And I mean, it's true. And I ended up buying better cameras, and I bought better filters. I changed my lighting. I got rid of some ugly corals. I put some prettier ones in. Now everyone's like, I love your tank no matter what I talk about. So you got to take some criticism to improve what you're doing. Okay, when you're setting up your system, when you're setting up your sump, when you're doing your plumbing, it's going to take time. If your spouse says, look, we have somewhere to be in 4 hours, you might not want to be setting up your tank right now. You might say, okay, let's go out in 4 hours. I'll do this tomorrow. I had a guy here in the area that said, Mark, I love your plumbing. I want to do exactly like that under my aquarium. I'm going to hire you to do it. I said, I don't know. And he said, no, seriously, it's perfect. I'm like, well, thank you. Okay. He says, how much will it cost? And I said, I have no idea. I said, but you can buy all the parts, and then I will do it, and I'll work by the hour, and when the job is done, you pay me. And he was like, okay. So we got on the phone. We figured out, we did a whole parts list. He got on the phone with the company I recommended, which was Savco, and we looked up all these components. We were on a three-way phone call. No, we need this. We don't need that. We need this. Got everything ordered. 2 days before I'm supposed to go there, he says, hey, Mark, so you're coming Saturday? I was like, yes, I am. It's like, well, how long is it going to take? And I was like, I don't know. It could be 10 hours. It could be 12 hours. This is a slow-going project. And he's like, well, I can only afford you for 4 hours. I was like, okay. So he said, so what's going to happen? I said, well, are you going to help me? He goes, yeah. I said, okay, you'll work next to me. And when we hit 4 hours, I'll stop and I'll leave. And he's like, and then what? I said, you'll hopefully have learned enough. You can continue. And he was like, I was like, I mean, he kind of knew for a while this could take a long, I mean, never promised anything remote. So anyway, we didn't go through with it. He changed his mind. But he had already bought all the plumbing. So he decided to do it himself. And I ran into him in the fish store 2 months later. And I said, hey, how's it going? And he's like, oh, hi, Mark. And I said, well, how long did it take you? He said, oh, I know what you're trying to do there. I'm not trying to do anything. How long did it take? It took me 3 days. I said, yeah, that sounds right. And he was like, oh. I was like, it takes a long time. When I did my plumbing, I did all the drains on the first day. I did all the returns on the second day. I did all the manifold on the third day. And then it was done. But if you take your time and set it up all right, it'll last you for 9 years, which is what we want. We don't want to have to sit there and, I wish I'd done this later on. You want to make sure that your system is robust, which means it can handle anything that gets thrown at it. We want to make sure that it is reliable. We want it built with good quality parts. If you are just using things that you don't really trust, it's usually going to bite you. And like I keep saying, make it easy to work in. So, what else can go wrong? Power goes out, you need power. I'm a big fan of owning a generator. So I got this one 2 years ago after the big ice storm because my old generator blew up during the ice storm. And 2 days later, I was in Costco and there was this beauty and I was like, add to cart. And I hauled it to the cart. That thing is heavy. That's a 50 amp generator. It's ridiculously large. Runs a gasoline, natural gas, propane. So no matter what, I can run it. And I think it was $700. I just last week added that super giant green plug on the front that just plugs in like a fist. And then it runs through a huge cable the size of a garden hose that goes into my garage to a special panel that has these double breakers where it flips from electricity to generator. And this is the super safe way to run electricity into your house because the generator's outside, it's running on gas, it's emitting noxious fumes like a car would do. And if it's near your house, if their doors are open or windows are open, because you're bringing in cords through doorways, you might get a headache because of the exhaust. And I kept trying everything I could to not get headaches. I'd run my generator outside the garage. I would plug in a huge fan and point it at the generator to blow the exhaust away from the house. And yet I'm in my house and I'm just like, I got such a headache again. So I knew I was slowly killing myself. So instead, I ended up putting in fake outlets in my fish room that didn't work. They were dead as a doornail. But on the other side of the outlet was an extension cord that I could run to my generator. And when I had to do something in a power outage, I would go ahead and I would, the power's gone. I would go grab that extension cord from the other side of the wall. I'd run to the generator, under the garage door, bring the door down, and hope the fumes didn't get in the house. And that worked really well. But this is so much nicer. So on the left side of that panel is the circuit breaker box for the fish room. So that's 6 circuits that feeds my entire fish room of all the aquarium stuff. There's outlets everywhere. And now I've got this huge box next to it that feeds that panel 50 amps of power, which is 5 times more than I need. But that means I can plug anything inside the house into the fish room, and I can plug in my refrigerator. I can plug in a space heater. I can run lights throughout the house and see instead of busting out all the candles. And I can just have a little bit of comfort. Have the TV on, got the router going, see what the internet's saying. It's convenient that way. I mentioned automation. It's really important to set it up in a clean way and to follow the instructions of the manufacturer. A lot of times people will take stuff that the manufacturer says must be like this and they install it like this. And then those things fail, or they get water in them, or they burn up because they overheat. So it's really important, follow those instructions, mount them up high where they stay dry. I make these shelves, like in the middle picture, to put the power bricks on. So that way, if water were to spill next to the sump, it doesn't hit the power bricks. So we try to elevate everything up and get everything nice and dry and safe and tied up. And it's this system over here on the far right is my power center that's next to my reef. And I have all these switches I can just flip on and off, like turn off the skimmer, turn off the calcium reactor, turn off the top off. It's very nice and convenient. And underneath it, I have a CO2 tank for my calcium reactor. It's on a tidy spot. I'm not going to trip over cords. I have all my cords going through the top and through the back and then plugging in. So if water were to somehow follow the cord, it will drip down. It won't go into the outlets and cause a fire. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I was told to be done in 45 minutes, and I think I did it. If you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I hope you guys have a good day at Aquashella.